interesting that these wasps they'll have wasp species that are kind of just for certain uh host species. So they're parasitic, and most wasps are parasitic, and they'll have this relation with this host species that is very specific. And the question was, well, how does this happen? Because it's pretty extraordinary. It seems like so the way that the intellect puts it together is that the wasp must have some kind of deep knowledge of the nervous system of their host. So one, it's kind of like the this wasp will sting the host and something like six different spots on its brain and nervous system and spine and whatnot in order just to paralyze it while keeping it alive in just the right way so that it can lay its eggs and it'll be paralyzed but still alive. And yeah, it's an interesting thing. But Bergson's got a story about it in Creative Evolution. Yeah, I'm not sure how to segue into Heidegger for that. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, what would be the Dasein of a wasp? I mean, it seems like it's very specific in terms of how it propagates its species and it's connected to eating, feeding, right? Sustaining itself. And usually in animals or insects, my memory is that the two aren't connected, right? Procreation, procreation, and food are two different kinds of acts, but it seems like for the wasp, they're connected.
I remember Chase saying that Heidegger thought only human beings are Dasein. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Well,
But you
okay.
wanted to disagree with him?
So
Well,
here's my segue, and I'm gonna introduce a little popular culture since we talked about Heinlein a little bit earlier, and I'm gonna mix popular culture with Dostoevsky, and I'm gonna attempt to do this in my brain. So what Ed was mentioning Starship Troopers because we were talking about bugs earlier and how it was like when Heinlein was approaching his villain phase of imperialism and fascism. What's really popular in the gaming community right now is Helldivers 2, where you play a nameless soldier who is just slaughtering bugs in order to and automatons in order to promote Super Earth. And yeah, the gaming fungus, possibly. And the writers of this particular story were doing over the top satire with Heinlein. As you know, you're slaughtering these bugs, and you find out that the bugs ultimately are planted on these planets, and you're using their fuel, their corpses as fuel to sustain Super Earth's imperialist empire. And some of the players are starting to feel guilty because they're realizing in this nameless hero that they're playing in their core are really the villains of the story. Like anything that is voted as an awareness of the economic system making you this nameless cog in a machine, particularly in the name of imperialism, is viewed as a dissident. And it's produced a little bit of a sense of guilt and it's met with violence. And it reminded me of this component of Heidegger in this section where he's talking about conscience and authentic existence and what do you do with it? Well, why would you feel guilty about that? Because the game is exploded because everyone's like, yay, they're over the top with their satire and we're diving in and slaughtering these people in the name of democracy and it's great. But there's a portion that are feeling guilty playing this character and it ties into the concept of freedom because it reminded me of the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky, where Christ comes back and says, "Hey, I'm here to offer freedom to the church and to provide people with something that doesn't just fall within the lines of what the church has already established." And the Pope says, we don't want anything to do with you. So like this is at its core something that people don't want. They don't want an an idea of freedom. You know, like the idea of freedom is choice. And if choice enters into the picture rather than adherence, they would prefer to have the freedom that falls in line. They'd prefer to have the freedom that's defined by the Helldivers. They'd prefer the freedom that's defined by the Grand Inquisitor and Dostoevsky. You need to have a conscious idea of what freedom is. What Christ was introducing was an aspect of agency and awareness of self, which I think is really interesting for Heidegger to introduce this idea of consciousness, because for freedom to exist in an individual, the first, it's actually a very terrible thing, because it needs to, number one, bring about a aspect of self introspection, and in that it takes you away from the they self, and it kind of isolates you to a point where it is terrifying to actually have the burden of that freedom, where you're analyzing yourself and you're isolated. So that's where my mind was drawing Helldivers, Dostoevsky, and this idea of consciousness. The basis of authentic existence for Heidegger, when it comes from when I read him, is that a moral choice or guilt is tied into the existential, because its precursor is freedom. And that freedom is tied into the authentic self that requires you to isolate and be be withdrawn and do introspection, and we prefer to get ourselves lost in the day self. We prefer to just have freedom defined for us and taken care of.
Although I don't think that guilt as an existential characteristic is moral guilt. I think that moral guilt and all those other it's again, that kind of standard thing that he does where he says, well, we've got all these phenomenological features of Dasein, but what is kind of underlying, what's the existential basis for that? And so, what I got from these sections was that guilt in this existential sense is not a particular kind of guilt, and it's not moral guilt, and it's not debt, and it's not all that kind of the stuff. Yeah, exactly, as Chase wrote. But that existential condition is a necessary condition for all those other forms of guilt that factical Dasein experiences, like moral guilt and guilt for not paying debts and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I don't think he's saying it's a project at hand where it's essentially like theology. I think he's saying it's fundamentally different from theology, and it's not associated with alignment of a particular moral code. It's more of, what about you when you commit this act, where we're analyzing this component of who is the I when I feel guilty for doing a certain thing. Why do I feel guilty playing an imperialist in a leisure? Like, what part of me, like in a video game, in a leisure participation, what part of me feels guilty about that? And I think that's what he's trying to analyze. It's not theology, it's not moral adherence. It is a framework, as Chase said, the conditions for the possibility of morality that's not a project at hand.
I push back a bit. I think when you say feel guilty, it already introduces a kind of empirical element. And the way you described it, feel guilty by playing the imperialist, kind of lays it out in a moralist terms, which I think Heidegger's really trying to go deeper than that, more ontological.
Yeah, again, so that ontological condition is the precondition for being able to feel guilty. So when it emerges into an actual feeling in a particular person, that's not the existential condition. That's I'm thinking that's a sort of an ontical condition rather than an ontological condition. It's an ontical, something that shows up in factical Dasein.
To kind of supplement my point, we can imagine Heidegger himself not feeling the least bit guilty about acquisition of Lebensraum.
Acquisition of what?
Lebensraum, living space.
Living space, usually out in the east of Europe.
The conquests, you know what I mean? Like, we're gonna take Sudetenland. We're gonna annex Austria. We're gonna take half of Poland. We need the space, So, like, I think Heidegger could locate that feeling of guilt in the they self. Oh, you've succumbed to the modern democratic, each nation deserves its sovereignty. No, that's really just a derivative feeling. There's an ontological guilt that lies underneath that.
Okay, well, thank you. So what if the ontological is deeper, what does it consist of?
My
Go ahead.
sense. Go ahead.
No. I mean, that's the subject of a lot of this chapter, right? Like, I mean, it is an ontological lack with regard to. I mean, it's kind of confusing, and that's like what we're here to discuss, right? A lack with regard to the mood of understanding towards one's authentic own most possibility of understanding, insofar as our mode is not fully authentic, then there's a lack there that, and the feeling of that lack is a kind of guilt. I mean, I don't feel like I'm being perfectly accurate here to Heidegger, but I'm kind of touching it in general ways.
So my sense, and this may be too much, affected by existentialists who borrowed from him. So maybe maybe this is not correct. But my sense, he keeps talking about thrownness, and earlier he talked about groundlessness, and so my sense is that when I probably shouldn't say person, but when one runs up against the groundlessness of one's own existence, in other words, I've been thrown into the world. I was not placed into the world by a God. And again, I'm borrowing too much from people like Sartre, but I just sort of showed up. And yet, because Dasein is the kind of being that is its own possibilities, there's this I don't needs probably not the right word, but there's this I am a project. I am projected into the world, and I would like to have some answers as to what kind of project I should have, and I would like for someone to give me a project, and I would like for someone to tell me what the proper kind of project is, but there isn't anything. There's no one doing that. And so I'm just kind of existentially, I'm just kind of free floating in this void. I'm thrown into the world, and yet, and again, maybe I'm borrowing too much from Sartre, but I'm thrown into the world, and nevertheless, I'm responsible for everything I do. And so this is connected to what I think what Joseph was talking about is in the notion of freedom. And again, I may be borrowing too much from Sartre, but I don't really have any excuse. I mean, I can make excuses. I can say, well, it's my nation that causes me to make this kind of choice. It's my church. It's my family. It's whatever. I'm looking for a ground. I'm looking for some foothold, someplace I can put my foot on that I can base my values on, base my choices on, and in a sense that I can blame for making those choices. But there isn't any of that. I'm just, here I am. And I think, my sense is that the guilt is I'm guilty in the sense that I am, maybe I'm connecting it to Mr. Sartre, but I kind of must generate these projects because that's what Dasein is. But there isn't any basis for it. There isn't any fundamental ground. And yet I'm responsible for everything I do when I do that. And so I'm already kind of guilty from the outset for what I'm going to do, because it's not like he's suggesting here, it's a condition of existence. It's not like God made me guilty, or it's not like I'm violating a law of God or anything like that. It's just this, like as Joseph was saying, this freedom and this responsibility of being thrown and projected into the world, it includes this not sense, but includes this ontological condition of guilt. It's just what it means to be this kind of thrown being in the world. That's my sense. But again, maybe I'm borrowing too much from later existentialists.
But that's what I thought about what Heidegger was saying is, don't cop out and say, well, I believe this because my fill in the blank, my family, my parents, my church, my country. That's not you living. That's not you being authentic. That's a cop out. you're just the tail of a kite, you're the tail of a dog, have that it's the fully embracing of whatever it is that you decide is going to be your project, and it's the intensity and the authenticity and your embracing of it that gives it value, not because anybody else thinks that way.
Yeah, that's my general sense too. And I guess, and I'll defer to Chase here, but and this is part of based on what we talked about in previous discussions, is it seems like one difference between Heidegger and Sartre is that Sartre seems to think that freedom is very expansive. That I can kind of break free of there's certain factical conditions in life. Like I can't say I wished I had been born to different parents in a different century, and there's stuff like that. Okay, I can't do anything about that, but nevertheless, who and what I am, I can kind of make myself into what I want to be. I have this freedom, whereas like Sartre keeps emphasizing that whatever authentic Dasein is, it's kind of a modification of inauthentic Dasein, and so it seems like he would say, I can never completely extract myself from the they self. So what I'm reading it the same way you are, except that there seems to be more the they self and inauthenticity seems to be more of a constraint upon the scope of that freedom for Heidegger than it is for Sartre. At least that's what it seems like to me.
Yeah, I think I read that similar, like the thrownness is almost an excuse to not have the burden of freedom. Like they're like for the cardinal and the Grand Inquisitor, for anybody who tries to escape in the day self, for again pop culture reference, the Helldiver spreading freedom and democracy, the choices have already been made. And that's what we want to avoid. We don't want the burden of freedom. We don't want self-introspection, and we certainly don't want to be isolated because it's Dasein kind of calling to itself. So that's something we want to avoid. And that guilt, in a way, we try to like either pin on thrownness or projects at hand so that we don't have to choose a project or feel the guilt or the call of conscience associated with them.
Yeah, and my suspicion is he would say that theological answers are they're part of that system of excuses. If I can find an ontological ground, for example, I am a creation of God, then well then I just like, well, I'm just kind of playing out the God, I'm playing out human nature as God designed it, or I guess probably even some kind of naturalism. But I guess one thing which as I'm sorry I'm talking too much, but one thing that I'm still a little unclear in is again this, if I'm right, this interplay between for Heidegger between the restrictions, or the fact that we never completely escape the they self, that we can never completely escape inauthenticity. So I guess I'd like to ask if you guys think that that's what he's saying, that whatever freedom we have, it's not like this sort of Sartrean freedom. It's freedom's always going to, and your ability to make these choices and to choose your projects is always going to be modified or constrained or something by the they self.
Does he use is in anywhere in this work, is there like a word when you were talking about it, I was just talking of thinking of the term striving, and I don't know if literally the word striving is ever used as a translation for what he uses, but the way you're describing it, I mean, how do I phrase it? It's just because it's difficult doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to always try to do that, right? That it's the striving that makes us authentically real. And yeah, we have to have a lot of self-discipline. It takes energy, it takes self-discipline. But what kind of life do we want to lead? Do we want to be a more intelligent sheep, or do we want to really articulate ourselves as much as humanly possible for ourselves, no matter what the limits are on us, so that the striving is what's important?
Given the fact that he says he's doing ontology, not ethics, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the answer to that question
No, but I
is.
mean, I mean this. Well, anyway, let me just say one more thing. I'm not necessarily saying he's saying. I think he's talking about individual persons, not necessarily communities, and that, in a sense, ask yourself what kind of life you individually want to leave to make you as authentically your life and not other people's lives. And if you don't want to do that, that's fine. Then stop bitching about it. But if you want to live an authentic life that is truly your life, it would. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm not saying this very well. I don't. It reminds me, begging your pardon, Eric, it kind of reminds me of Kant to a certain way. My sense of certain writings of Kant is he's talking about how does one live an individual life, right? What should be the basis of individual life? And then that got thrown into a societal or community norm. And sometimes I think that Heidegger's not necessarily saying, here's a way to, it's not a self-help book. I don't think he's saying that he's not trying to write political philosophy, but I think he's saying if we are truly accidentally here, then what's the point? And if we're here for a short amount of time, what else is there than to be as true to yourself as you possibly could be, no matter what the constraints are?
And I think, yeah, it's twofold. The way I read it, to similar to how you and Nevitt read it, is that his project is based in design, like the you can't separate the authentic and inauthentic from design. It's different modes. So in order for you to have authentic selfhood, to even obtain that, it has to be in design, which can be authentic nor inauthentic at times. So, and that freedom is a kind of individuation in the dread that is produced from the call of conscience, which he seems to say is rooted in care. And he does seem to deviate from Kant a little bit. I mean, my sophomoric understanding of Kant is that he's not trying to say, do I need to learn what I ought to do? And then does that make me feel bad? Or am I first answering a call, as he put it, um, to live an authentic life and then establish the moral code after that? And I think that seems to be where he's kind of deviating from Kant a little bit, like to make guilt an existential foundation of morals rather than discovering an axiomatic code in metaphysics, to kind of not go into the Cartesian subject objects type system he wants to avoid.
This section I found quite confusing.
What's this?
Say what?
This was the only section that confused the whole
Oh
text.
no,
Confuses
no,
me.
definitely not. No. But it was especially confusing. And I know you can say that pretty much about every section of this book, but especially confusing. Um, so he was really stressing a bunch of things that it's hard to even explain, I think, what is the issue there. But so one thing that so I think of okay, so the readings of that it's this kind of like Sartrean, you're burdened with your own freedom kind of thing. I do think that there is an element of that, but it's more limited and conditioned here and kind of specific, I guess. And I think in one way, I think it does help to kind of get it. It's much easier to see kind of what Sartre's point is in general, uh, versus Heidegger's here at least. So I think it's not bad as a way to kind of like get our foot in the door. Although I would be cautious about putting too much of an emphasis on those aspects because, okay, the so freedom, he does of course talk about, but he doesn't talk about nearly as much as this idea of thrownness and this being a basis, ground really is probably how it should have been translated, but and then of course this idea of nullity or the null, the not, which is I found that quite interesting. Um, is yeah, so he's saying that okay, so one thing I still am not sure about is when I think about it, okay, why is he so he's talking about conscience and he's talking about guilt. He doesn't mean the kind of everyday common sense use of those terms, but he has to have some kind of reason for why he's using them. And he does give some kind of reasons, but then still, when I think about it, I am not quite sure exactly why he's still using these terms. It's not like, I mean, this isn't to say like that his project is null and void or whatever, but why guilt exactly? It doesn't seem so the way he defines it, it kind of makes sense in a very like it's like a tangential point almost that everybody agrees that it's something that conscience has it gives you the message of the call of conscience gives you the message of guilt. And then from there he says, okay, well, look at these common sense ways to think about guilt or the ordinary significations of this is that so he goes into the German Schuld, I think that's what it is. So that means debt as well as guilt, which I mean if you there's tons of notes about this, not tons, but in the M&R translation where they explain this. And if you've read the genealogy of morals, especially the second essay, there's Nietzsche puts a lot of stock in this, also this ambiguity of Schuld as guilt and debt and whatnot, which is also a really interesting kind of parallel implicit semi-commentary with the second essay of the genealogy of morality that I don't even know exactly how I would compare them, but it seems like Heidegger wants to do something at least with those terms, themes. I mean, they're both kind of these extra moral ways of understanding the conditions of morality, and they give both the same kind of ideas about what it takes for there to be a responsible person who can be held responsible. So yeah, it's interesting. It's just another one of the many mysteries of this section that I was just like, possibly that'd be interesting to know about it, but I don't. But so guilt is this the definition that he eventually gets is that it's the basis of a nullity. And that I think that's kind of the key, not just because it's a definition, but I think that really gets into, okay, if he is gonna, if he's not just using random terms and just being like, well, what do you think is guilt isn't really guilt, but that he wants to take something from the ordinary significations of guilt and then use that in a constructive way for his own existential conception of it, then what is that? I think that is there in that definition. And I think that gets into also, so this idea he has about a basis, the basis of a nullity, or it's really kind of two, which seems to be its thrownness and projection, that these are both have a kind of not associated with them. And so some parts that he's talking about thrownness, it seems like he's not that, especially the thrownness aspect, the emphasis is definitely not on freedom. It's basically that you don't choose to be Dasein or to be what you are. There's an element in which you simply are that, and we don't know where this came from or why. So we're kind of these questioning beings, but we run into this limit at these kind of ultimate questions where we try to have a kind of meta question about our own being. We're the being that questions, but we can't really, we can question our own being, but in a way that can never be really resolved. And I think that's one part of that nullity aspect, that there is no solution to that element in terms of our thrownness. There's a limitation there, but that's also the basis of our being. So we aren't the basis of our being, but we're given this basis, and that's our being, but we don't actually choose that. We are thrown into that, and we don't know why. But as Dasein, we are in a way compelled to at least wonder the whence and the why. And maybe that's part of the reason why we then have all these what he'll consider, inauthentic conceptions of guilt that go into all sorts of different things. But yeah, so there's that element, the thrownness as the basis for that nullity, but then you're thrown into your possibilities as projection, but then that also has this limitation and a nullity that corresponds with that too, because you can only choose certain possibilities that nullify other ones. So there's also this aspect of a nullity, and that makes some more sense in terms of, okay, if he's conditioning morality kind of on the basis of some idea about responsibility or freedom of some type, seems like he's doing that with this move here in some way. How exactly, I'm not quite sure. But so you don't choose to be Dasein, you're thrown into being Dasein, and that gives you the basis for certain possibilities, which you then choose, but at the cost of not choosing other ones. So I think that's this double nullity that defines kind of the either side of the limits of our being, and that's also our guilt in terms of this responsibility for those nullities, even though we didn't, even though we're not like voluntarily like doing them. Is in one sense the thrownness, especially there's absolutely the whole point is that we don't do it, that we're thrown into it. So I don't know. A lot of random associations there about just what I was thinking. So yeah. What is going on with this section? What is this? What is I don't know. Somebody help me out.
I thought part of the nullity was also that that Dasein is not Dasein is its possibilities, but that's sort of at least existentially, but that's a sort of emptiness right there because it doesn't. I mean, I am my possibilities. Great. But what are those possibilities? Well, they're certainly constrained by facticity and so on. And like you said, if I choose some, I nullify others. But as being my own possibilities, and it seems to me that is kind of a nullity because it's just okay. I mean, it doesn't tell me, it gives me no help as to what to do, where to go, how to actualize, what possibilities to actualize, or anything. It's just so that there seems to be, as part of that groundlessness and that thrownness, Dasein is just this kind of engine of possibility, but as such, there's just sort of an emptiness there, it seems to me. Anyway, that's I thought that may have been part of the nullity.
Yeah, yeah, Joey and I were discussing it in the chat, is that like from an ontological standpoint, first off, Chase, I'm glad that someone has random thoughts and connects them from musings like I do. It makes me feel less alone. But the 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 ontological perspective of guilt itself individuating like dread, it focuses on the unique self, the authentic self, away from the they self. So in a way, it's the self's projection of possibilities. And when you do that, it's also a way to exclude possibilities as well. So that notness almost implies in a way that Dasein at its core, in its finitude, is always guilty. It's always guilty because of this notness of some of the projects that you're not choosing at that time. And we tend to want to escape into the they self and not have that burden of individuation and self-introspection. So to be the like what does it mean to be guilty? I think that's how he's trying to tie it into this primordial sense. It's like a knowledge of your finitude. It's a knowledge of how you express who you are. You're capable of notness and possibilities simultaneously. And that I think that's where he's trying to tie it into dread as well.
I was writing stuff, but I'll just say it. Part of this is a response to Joey, at least I think what Joey was suggesting above. He often starts with, which again makes me think of Aristotle, but he begins with some sort of everyday kind of condition that we experience in the ontic world, and then tries to, almost like a transcendental deduction, tries to work backwards and figure out what's the existential foundation for that. And as Joey was saying, that he is trying to get to the, well, I guess in the next section he's going to start talking about the vulgar forms of guilt. At least that's the way Stambaugh translates it. And so why use the word guilt for this, for this existential thing? Well, presumably because it is the existential underpinning for these ontic forms that we, in everyday guilt, like moral guilt and those other forms of guilt. So And maybe it's a weird word, but maybe to choose for this condition, but maybe that's a big reason.
And I kept trying to think of like what is it to be guilty? What is it that like when I was thinking about some of the things that I feel guilty about, what does that mean to me? What does it mean to be guilty? And that's interesting to me because it's like we have a tendency to blame it on outside circumstances or reduce it to the ontic or reduce it to projects or objects at hand. But when I do think of it existentially, it's like this component of the projection of all my possibilities. And I know he somehow tied that to a component of understanding, which I'm still not quite clear of. But when I realize that my guilt in that situation is uniquely my own, I can't withdraw into the they. And we kind of don't want to do that. Um, and that's really interesting from his standpoint because it's almost like he's saying that there's this isolated self-projection in this of one's own way of being guilty. And it's I think he's saying when you have that, that's when you're ready to accept dread. And that dread is different from fear, and that dread is its individuation as well. And it kind of lays the groundwork of how Dasein can be tied to consciousness and the call, and that it's part of an everyday experience. It's not something that requires a mystic or a code or an adherence to a certain law. It's a component of everyday existence.
You know, the connection with anxiety or angst or dread or however you want to translate that, and uncanniness. So those are interesting topics, although I I think while I was reading it, I had something of a idea about how those were connected. But then it's one of the cases that, well, this happens pretty often with Heidegger, at least in my experiences. I feel like I kind of understand it while I'm reading it, and then give it like a few hours, and I'm just like I've can't remember what is going on with that. And I feel like that connection with exactly how guilt is involved with that is still fuzzy. Okay, so the call of conscience, I think that makes a little more sense in that so the call of conscience, it appeals to the self and the mode of the they self, but in the form of the more or less authentic self. So you have this kind of doubling of the self where the authentic self kind of appeals through reticence and this experience of anxiety that unveils the uncanniness. Uh, that's what's going on with the call of conscience. And I get how anxiety is used there, but then I guess the next step is then how does that dynamic of the call relate exactly to even the guilt, except I mean I know so he says I believe the message of the call of conscience is guilty, exclamation point, very dramatic. So I don't know. I'm still kind of like what is going on there? I don't know.
About that call of conscience, I mean, I'm reading it in similar terms. It seems to be it's a call to face one's guilt or to live authentically, or what it means to be authentic is to face one's guilt, and that is the call of conscience towards, an authentic. But I wanted to pose this question. It seems like the way Heidegger's setting it up, we can understand the call of conscience to take the form of a kind of command. I think I suggested it last week. Like it seems to be to thine own self be true. Like when and this own self being true, but being understood in the very way that Heidegger sets up authenticity. If it can be formed if it could be formulated roughly, right? Kind of like a command, right? The second question is, isn't it the kind of command that would apply to all Dasein without regard to any specific projects that we might be engaged in as such? In other words, it's a kind of command that's not really hypothetical in any sense, but would apply, again, equally to all Dasein. You see what I'm getting at? I hope you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think that's one of your bingo spots is checked off.
But I think it's
Categorically.
as you suggested, it's content. I mean, as you implied, I think it's contentless. And so, I mean, it's a good question. So, Kant says, well, the categorical imperative really is just a form. It's a formula. It's a form. But you can use that form to determine very specific duties. And my guess is that Heidegger would deny that last part. And it may have to do with something, with the role of reason or something. I don't know. But it seems to have a similar structure in that it's a formal call that is really formal. But I'm guessing he would say, but you can't then derive specific duties from it the way Kant does.
I think that's fair. I mean, I'm not at all trying to establish an identity or say that Heidegger surreptitiously snuck in the categorical and imperative under a different name with slight modifications. But there does seem to be some really strong echoes.
I mean, I guess, as, like Joy said, that command has a different sense. I mean, my sense of call is, if anything, it's a call to awareness more than a command of telling me to do something. Because, I mean, the categorical imperative is a command, right? It's an imperative. Whereas I think the call seems not to be an imperative or a command. It seems to be a call to awareness, something like that, a call to awareness that I am the ground of my own projects, that I am a groundless throne wad of possibilities. That's what the call is. It's a call to become aware, something like that, more than a call to action or a command.
Yeah, I think there's still a kind of nullity on it. Doesn't tell you exactly what to do, but sets you up nevertheless as the basis in a sense for something that you would do, and indeed kind of says that you do have to choose some things, and you don't have a perfect ability to be able to discern kind of all the causes of, first of all, why you have these possibilities, why to do these. So there's kind of, yeah, so in a sense, he's kind of showing the limitations, or the kind of the conditions of impossibility to a certain extent as well, about certain things we can't do, and that we, I guess, I mean, he's not necessarily saying this, maybe I'm reading my own wish fulfillments in here, but he's kind of setting up something of this is why you can't say ontologically there's some kind of moral judgment that he's not grounding moral judgment against the ontology of Dasein, or even necessarily against setting up where we can now do that, make judgments about individual Daseins necessarily. Although I don't think, I mean, he could still do that. I mean, he's not, but he could, maybe. But but yeah, I think yeah, so there's some stuff that definitely reminded me of Kant and I mean, the little bit I know about the second critique. So I didn't really think so much about the imperative element, but the thing that I was thinking of was so if he's giving the conditions of possibility for morality, that seems to be something like what Kant's project was too, where that's why he says that we need, what are those three ideas? The freedom,
God and the immortality of the soul.
God, and immortality of soul. Yeah. So those are necessary ideas of practical reason that we need to ground morality, right?
Postulates, yes.
Yeah. So it seems like he's doing something kind of like that, and especially, and also in that kind of formalistic manner, and even mentions that a few times about the formalism of certain things. So it seems like that's definitely
Well,
space for comparison to some degree, but at the same time, of course, very different from Kant in a lot of ways.
but I don't think that's his project though here. Like I think he's saying guilt comes before ethics. I don't think he's throwing out the baby with the bathwater with Kantian ethics, but I also don't think he's trying to provide a moral framework for Dasein. I think his project, or one of the questions that he seems to be asking is that like what needs to be like presupposed about human consciousness that we even have this hint or desire to do something that is right or to know what one ought to do at all. It's like why do we even care? Like how does that fit into design? Like why don't I even ask myself what I ought to do? And I think he's saying that that guilt tied into the finitude is more so like he's looking at the structure of design rather than presenting a moral framework, and that that guilt kind of presupposes any ethics, so it gets into the primordial aspect of being and creating your projects. He's not trying to provide you an axiom of what that project should be.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Holy shit.
Yeah, so he's talking about the conditions of possibility for morality, but he's definitely not giving some kind of normative ethics of, you ought to do these things, even if it's just a kind of, uh, the form of the categorical imperative or whatnot. Uh, so he doesn't go as far as Kant in that. So Kant, he grounds morality, but then he also gives a morality, where I think Heidegger does not do the second step in that, as you basically just said, Joseph. But yeah,
It seems to be that that's where he's kind of, isn't that where he's like differentiating from how do I say his name? Cassier? Like Cassier when he argued with him at Davros, like he's offering different, a different ontology, a different approach, a twist, if you so to speak.
I don't know anything about Cassio.
I know very little. Philosophy of symbolic forms, some kind of neo-Kantian thing about history, right? That's pretty much it. Yeah. And I know that, yeah, you had some kind of debate with Heidegger in 1929. I don't even know how I know that, but I think that's right. But I know very little about um, exactly what his idea was. Yeah. I know John Caputo. I think I listened to a podcast about him. It's like a Derridian, right? I think Joey asked in the chat. That's why I'm saying that.
Is he the guy
Can y'all
that's
hear me okay?
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, now I was just getting a lot of, because Caputo, yeah, very Derrida influence. My impression is Derrida is like hugely influenced by Heidegger as well. But it's interesting because Heidegger's like setting up his analysis of conscience as like an alternative to the theological approach, and it's interesting to see that I feel like John Caputo. I haven't like read a bunch of his stuff, but I've listened to a few of his talks, sifted through his books. But my impression is he kind of just runs with this notion of like God not as something present, but like as something absent, and in that like is this kind of positive power. Like I think he has a book like The Weakness of God, and I think it's all about just like this like I think he even uses the phrase, the terminology like this calling that can be just totally taken as like not real. And so it's weird for him to kind of like what I see him doing, sliding in behind Heidegger and then like appropriating it theologically, but stepping out of maybe like an ontology of presence.
I might even say a body without organs of limitless potentiality and notness.
Oh God. So apparently my parents are coming back tonight. Uh-oh. Better clean up all the roach spray everywhere.
You fed the foxes, that's the important part.
Actually, you know what? I didn't today.
Oh, you're in
Okay, the
trouble.
other thing, I went to get more of the deer food, and there's another roach in there, and that freaked me out. That was earlier today, and then the other incident with the roach happened, and then by then I haven't gotten the bag of deer food out yet from the garage, and yeah, it's a disaster. But anyways, oh
Well, forgive me, I'm gonna have to drop off early. I'm running on fumes. The coffee is wearing down, so I've made it to almost 8:40. Eric, I'm sorry. I can't drink more coffee. My stomach won't let me. I'm weak. But this
yeah,
was
that
good.
yeah, the weakness of God thing. So that makes me think of some of the Levinas, who I believe emphasizes that aspect. I wonder if that's also an influence on Caputo. Well, I know Levinas is an influence on Derrida, obviously. Yeah, there's a bunch of yeah, so I was reading some Levinas the other day, and it's really interesting commentary on tons of Heidegger, and you can see how all the later French people, they're all influenced really by this Levinas's take on Heidegger. It's really underappreciated how influential it is. And I think that's also what so he emphasized a few different things where he's kind of does these reversals. And one of them is something that uh maybe it's not exactly a reversal because it's kind of maybe this is in Heidegger that Heidegger is already stressing that there is this weakness or impotence kind of involved with our being, hence it's nullity. Um, Maybe something like that is already there in Heidegger, and people have picked up from that. I don't know.
So I'll tell this story. Something that happened to me that made this, and this is, I did not relate this to Heidegger at all, and maybe it's not, but I've mentioned this before, that when I was in grad school, I took this conference course from a guy who was a Kierkegaard scholar, and we read the Sickness Unto Death and the Concept of Anxiety. Woohoo! Wow, what a great thing to spend a semester on. And
Are you okay? You did that in a semester?
oh, it was tough. I tell you, by the end, I was a
Oh,
basket case. But um, but anyway, I've mentioned this before, that when you get to the end of the last, the end of part one, where he's giving this taxonomy of despair, he talks about demonic despair, which demonic despair is the most intensive form of despair. In despair, to will to be oneself. Rebelling against all existence, it feels that it has obtained evidence against its goodness. And I can't find the quotation, but he says someplace something like, and this person is nailed to himself for all eternity. It's like you're nailed to the wall and you drove the nail in yourself. And so in demonic despair is when the person says, yeah, I believe there's a God, and I believe that I was created by God, but God fucked up, and I'm proof because I am the error that God created. And there's no escape from that state, because this person is in defiance, choosing to be himself through all eternity as proof that God fucked up. And so this person is holding tight to his own being as an error because he's so mad at God. And when I first read this, like, oh damn, that's exactly where I am. And this notion of being nailed to the wall by yourself, by your own hand. And I mean, my God, I had some anxiety attacks there were nights where I would lay in bed and I was having these full body rushes, anxiety attacks. And it was this sense of having made a choice, freely having chosen to do something that I have no possibility of ever escaping, and having done it myself. And so, I don't know to what degree Heidegger's drawing on something like that, but I mean, when he's talking about angst, he's clearly drawing from Kierkegaard. There's a lot of places where he's drawing from Kierkegaard, and Kierkegaard goes through this whole analysis of despair and guilt. And Kierkegaard describes it's in the Sickness Unto Death. Despair is the sickness unto death. So the name of the book is The Sickness Unto Death, and that is despair. And he goes through this whole taxonomy of increasing degrees of despair. And that's where, like I said, you see this sort of Heideggerian thing where Kierkegaard says, if you're not in despair, that's proof that you're in despair. Kind of like, like Heidegger says, if you don't think if you don't think anxiety is the ground of your being, that's because anxiety is the ground of your being. But anyway, I just share that as sort of it was a gut punch, but it was, to a lot, granted, the anxiety as I felt it was not ontological. It was ontic, because I was having this physiological, emotional experience, which is, ontic. But I'm wondering if then Heidegger would say that Kierkegaard discovered something with that state, and he's got a different account of it. It doesn't have to do, it's not dependent upon a God, but in fact, absence of God just makes it worse, I think, for Heidegger. And so anyway, I just share that story to kind of, maybe share sort of a gut, visceral sense maybe of the state of the ontic sense of anxiety that maybe can emerge from this ground, this groundlessness, this sense of having to make one's own choices, freely choosing to actualize that possibility, and then there you are, having chosen yourself to be that. So
Didn't Alistair say something like that? Like whatever choices you make, regardless of how free you are, there's a despair to it. Heck, you made the choices. So it's, I think I remember him mentioning that when we were having lunch, and it hit me as well.
yeah,
Thank you for
so
sharing
my
that.
sense is that thrownness and that angst, the ontological structure that because Kierkegaard says these are structural features of the self, of consciousness. And I think Heidegger is secularizing it and then developing an ontology that reflects some of the same insights. Because my guess is that, I don't know if he says this explicitly, but my guess is that Heidegger would say that a lot of these Christian thinkers actually discovered something that is ontologically true of Dasein. They had an interpretation that he differs with, but that they uncovered certain features of what it means to be Dasein in being in the world.
I think he has a footnote about Kierkegaard where he says that he did some paraphrasing very loosely, but he did some good work, but didn't get to an existential level. It was still at the existential kind of ontic level, and also that his what is the term? The works, I can't remember the name of the when you it's like the educational works. What do you call those?
Pedagogical or
No.
Kierkegaard's
Yeah,
educational works.
it's kind of like teaching you something. I can't remember the term. I'll think of it.
A building something or other discourse.
Let me see if I can I'll try to find the footnote. I think it was towards this section. It was towards the beginning of the Division 2. Oh,
Oh, I
but
thought you were talking about Kierkegaard.
yeah, so it's something it's Kierkegaard has different like works, and one is what is it's not like
A
it's like
building
one is supposed to,
discourse or something.
no, I don't think so. Um yeah, I'll think of it eventually. But anyways, so I think he does credit Kierkegaard in that sense, and I do think he thinks that the Christian thinkers who have meditated on a lot of these issues do have some legit insights. Although at the same time, you'd say none of them has quite gone far enough. Is I mean, if they had, then what's the point in him doing it? Um, but yeah, so one thing though that I was thinking of is um so the way that anxiety and despair and all this is described, and I think especially in some cases in Kierkegaard, it sounds pretty negative. And then also with this emphasis on the nullity and the not. So there's usually some ambivalence about the negative in that, okay, is this kind of I mean, Heidegger probably wouldn't like this term, but a metaphysical negative, or is it more negative in a kind of an ordinary conception of that's bad, that's negative? It seems like there's always some ambivalence going on there, but I wonder is this a negative philosophy in the sense of, is there some pessimism here? Um, the descriptions of anxiety don't seem to be that negative, um, but they're not really super positive. Although I'd say in what is metaphysics, the way he talks about it is pretty positive, I would say. Um, but I wonder if like, is this something to, I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about the debate of between this of pessimism versus uh amoralism, or my own position, I guess. And yeah, I'm not sure. It seems like Heidegger wouldn't, at least he wouldn't want to go uh and say, okay, ontologically things are bad. Obviously that would not work. There's not going to be anything like that. But it seems like that's really what it takes to have something like a pessimism, is you have to, for it to be a really a metaphysical or ontological pessimism, it needs to be able to have a determinate value judgment made against ontology itself. And I don't know, where does Heidegger land on that spectrum? I've I feel like he wants to, the way that he puts values as something that's kind of further down the chain. It's something that's more produced rather than one of the conditions or the grounds or the existentials. That that means he's more operating from a kind of like a neutral base that's neither good nor evil, but grounds the possibility for either one, but then operating at these lower levels, so to speak. But I don't know. This just one topic I'm thinking about. I don't know.
I don't know. I really don't know where, what Heidegger would say, but the groundlessness, I mean, it scares me, but I don't think that has to necessarily be the response. So I'm thinking of Nietzsche, talking about dancing over the abyss. And so I think that it's possible to have a joyful response to that. I personally kind of struggle with that, but so I don't know the answer because I don't know Heidegger well enough. I don't know if he, what kind of, what's the word, valence this has for him. But I don't think, I mean, I think my guess is Nietzsche would say, yeah, granted, yeah, there's that anxiety, but that doesn't have to be a negative thing in the sense of resulting in nihilism or even despair. But maybe it depends on the person. But I don't know what Heidegger would say.
But
join the Nazi party, maybe. I don't know.
Most of you have been saying that you don't see, at least earlier in this work of Heidegger's, any kind of morality or ethics. That's not what he's about. And if I mean taking that as a correct interpretation, then I mean that's not the question he's asking. I mean, especially if you're saying, never, which I think makes a lot of sense, that, he may have said Kierkegaard was onto something, but too bad he got all tied up in the God stuff. If he had broken free, he would have been able to take his insights much further in the direction that Heidegger is arguing they need to go. And so, I mean, to me, that just looking at it from outside, so to speak, that's what is very scary to me. because what if it's one thing for a person writing a book to say we're thrown into the world, what makes our choices good in quotation marks or of value in quotation marks is that we individually, I've chosen that, and it is somehow connected to the inner core of who I am. But then you take that from the individual level and you toss it into the community realm, the polity. And how many times have we heard in the last 5 to 6 years? Well, actually, no, more like 8, now 8 to 9, how Trump has ignored boundaries, rules, norms, and how many times have you read people saying, like op-ed pieces, interpretive pieces saying, we seem to have become numb and we're not outraged because it's, quote, Trump just being Trump. I mean, end of quote. I have seen language to that extent for at least 3 years, right? It's like, oh, well, why do you take what he's saying so seriously? That's just him. And so he somehow is in this bubble where he can say things that for most of our history are just would not have been acceptable. And yet he seems to be floating above and also creating the storm below him. And I'm not saying that Trump ever read Heidegger. I'm not saying that Trump is Heideggerian, but what I mean is, if you're talking about authenticity and action and choice without any reference to ethics or morality, that's what I was trying to say before. What happens when you go from, the lack of a better term, individual level to the societal polity level?
Lord Henry Wotton. No recourse to conventional morality.
Right.
I know in self be true. You know what I mean? Like, again, like, I don't buy into society's idea of marriage. I'm married because I find it convenient. But she cavorts with other men, I cavort with other women. That's where we are today. I'm being true to myself, she's being true to herself. I mean, it's not just Trump, right? This has been around for a long time. This is part of the crisis of modernity, the dissolution of traditional values and appeals to universal morality that, have been kind of looming, and causing social anxiety, right?
So I've got two responses. One is Heidegger says he wants to do an ontology. And as part of that ontology, he seems to be explaining the ontological conditions for the possibility of there being a morality. That does not obligate him to construct a morality, because he's not what he's trying to do. He's trying to understand what it means to be Dasein, and part of what it means to be Dasein is to be a moral being. But what he's concerned with is, what are the conditions that make that possible for Dasein to be a moral being? That doesn't require him to do morality, because he's doing ontology. So, maybe you would say, well, that's a cop-out. I don't think it is. I think he's just saying, I'm part of what I'm doing is just explaining, why are we moral beings? Well, here's the answer. Here's the why. The other thing, and this is, I don't have a well worked out theory, but I've got a lot of thoughts on the issue you brought up about nihilism, which I don't think is. I don't know if Heidegger is ultimately a nihilist or not, but whether he is or not, that issue is not dependent on him. It doesn't require Heidegger. My short answer to that dilemma that you brought up, like with Trump, is to say, well, so here's an uncharitable thing. I admit this is uncharitable. sorry, with apologies to Eric and Ed. This is I'll cast it in the voice of Nietzsche, so I don't have to take responsibility for it. I think Nietzsche would say that universal moral claims, that people who make universal moral claims are trying to assert that everybody in the world should follow their own personal moral beliefs. That's what a universal moral claim is. It is an assertion that everyone in the world should behave the way I want them to behave. That's what it means to assert a universal moral claim. And then with regard to the situation with Trump, amoralism forbids one from making any universal moral claims. It does not forbid one from having values and from fighting for those values. So an amoralist can say, fuck Trump, I hate his values, I have my own values, and me and my buddies are going to work against him so that we can create a world that we want to live in, because we don't want to live in this world, his world. That doesn't require me. So, I think Nietzsche would say, again, to avoid responsibility for myself, Nietzsche would say, to say that there is some universal moral standard that Trump is violating, and it's that universal moral standard that gives me the right to condemn him, is an excuse. It's an excuse. It's saying, it's avoiding the real issue, which is I want everyone in the universe to follow my moral beliefs. And since I can assert there's a universal moral truth, I can assert that claim that you must do what I want you to do. That's a kind of excuse. The amoralist would say, no, I am not going to make that assertion. I'm just going to say Trump is fucked up. I hate what he's doing, and I'm going to try to stop him. And that's really all you can do. So that's my amoralist response to that concern.
Sure, and I mean, that was very nice of you the way you prefaced it, and even if you had not wrapped yourself in Nietzsche, I wouldn't have taken offense. But thank you for being understanding towards me. But what I would say in response is, since it's a polity and not necessarily a society I'm talking about, there is something called the Constitution and the rule of law. And that's not something that came out of my head. Right? The Constitution pre-exists me. And the laws, most of the laws that exist pre-existed my birth, certainly pre-existed me before I could vote. And I haven't really had an effect on that many. So, but again, I need to work through things, but my sense was, I'm going to toss something out, and please feel free to say, "Oh God, you've really got this wrong." But isn't could it be that what's lurking behind what Heidegger is talking about is some kind of concept of personal freedom? Because if he's saying there really is no ethics, morality, that's just social construct or religious construct or fill in the blank construct. And if we're talking about authentic humanness, our own personal individual humanness, I mean, it sounds to me more of like personal freedom, a radical personal freedom and liberty.
So I think, Chase was trying to caution us against interpreting freedom in Heidegger's sense like that. I mean, that sounds more like Sartre.
Okay.
So I don't know exactly what freedom means. I mean, he does use that word every now and then, and he also uses the word choice a lot and says choosing and choose and Dasein chooses, and so he does say that kind of thing. But two things. One, again, to say that Heidegger is interested in finding the ontological foundations for morality and does not commit him to any kind of moral belief, just that. It doesn't commit him to moral nihilism. It doesn't commit him to any, utilitarianism or deontology. He's just if he's trying to uncover the foundations of what makes morality even possible, I think he can do that as a research project. That doesn't require him or commit him to establishing any kind of morality. And so, because he's engaged in this ontology does not commit him necessarily to moral nihilism or to amorality or anything like that. I honestly don't have at this point much of a sense of what Heidegger would say about morality. I've tended to interpret him in this sort of Sartrean way, but then Chase, I'm sure with good reason, has kind of cautioned me against that. So I really don't know where Heidegger comes out on those kind of questions.
Yeah, I think I agree that he is there's clearly something where he wants to give an account of freedom in some sense, and I think that's because you look at these other I think he's definitely he's obviously if you look at his major influences that seem to be around this Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Kant, they also are stressing this kind of more or less individual freedom aspect as a condition in one way or another of something called morality. And so I think he wants to give an account of that as well. Although I think his account of what that freedom occurs with. So I remember, I think it's towards the beginning of, I believe, the section we read earlier. This week's reading. So it is talking about the self that does the appeal in the call of conscience. And then he gives a kind of, is pretty typical, but he gives first he does this sort of negative definition, as in he says what it's not. And one of the things, it sounds like, I'm not sure if he means it sounded like a kind of normal Cartesian thing, where he says, one thing that it's not is a subject, an innocuous subject with a personal consciousness. So I think.
Wait, so that Heidegger says that self is not that?
Yeah, correct. I think I got that right. So.
But he uses the word self all the time, so I'm like, what the hell is
Yeah,
it?
he does. I guess this thing, he has a lot of ideas about what it's not, and then some very specific ideas about what it is, and trying to figure out the latter especially is quite difficult, but also because there's multiple levels of the self. There's and that's what the call of conscience is, a appeal to the they self within the authentic self, from the authentic self. So it's this kind of split personality kind of thing going on. It's appealing to the authentic version is appealing to the inauthentic fallen version of itself. But that thing about the innocuous subject with a personal consciousness, I think that's that kind of the sort of empirical, ordinary or vulgar, it's the Stambod translation, which that's a interesting translation. So the vulgar interpretation of that kind of personal freedom would be something like that, which I think he would also associate with Sartre, really. especially later Heidegger is pretty critical of Sartre right along those levels.
Mm.
And I think that would also go on with that. So the ideas about guilt that also he's going to critique in some sense, but also he wants to provide an account of to explain the genesis of these things, the ordinary vulgar conceptions of guilt also, or the ontic conceptions, however he phrases it. So I think he wants to, as far as freedom is concerned, I think he does want to try to qualify exactly the self that is involved with freedom, which I think would involve all the basis as the nullity, where it's this thrown projection. So it's thrown into the world, doesn't choose that, but thrown into these certain possibilities amongst which it can only choose some by not choosing others. It seems like the freedom is somewhere in there. And so it's definitely something to do with this individuated Dasein. But he would definitely not want the individuation to appear on that level of the Cartesian subject, or which would be associated with a kind of personal consciousness or personal yeah, I don't know. The question of personality is kind of also somewhat ambivalent here, but because he's really strong on this mindness that Dasein has to do very much with this personal self. I can only think to call it that. But then he's also, when you really look at it, all these things they all seem very impersonal, to me at least. But that's another thing that Levinas picks up on when he's kind of very influenced by Heidegger, but also uh, quite incisively critical of him. And that's one of the kind of the reversals that he does is, well, what is this, that it is, being that it is, and that it has to be, that calls me. It's doesn't seem connected with a kind of ordinary personality based self. So, which I mean, I think that's interesting. I like that line of thought. But anyways, I think I need to leave soon so that my mom does not have a heart attack seeing all the roach spray. And so another to go along with the speaking, maybe end, if I don't know if we're going to end, but how we started. So one of the reasons why I think I have such a horrible phobia is because my mom is even worse. My mom has like panic attacks.
Oh, really?
She sees one, she'll start like hyperventilating, and like it's even worse. So
Well, do you allow the word genetic in terms of personal characteristics,